It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
If I were an Arab leader, I would never sign an agreement with Israel. It is normal. We have taken their country. It is true God promised it to us, but how could that interest them? Our God is not theirs. There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz, but was that their fault? They see but one thing. We have come and stolen their country. Why would they accept that?
Those are the words of David Ben-Gurion, reported by Nahum Goldman in his 1978 book, The Jewish Paradox, read by our very own Jimmy Lee Wirt. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
I have an amazing show today.
We do. And to join us for that is the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. It's right. David is right. These are very courageous people.
As the assault on Gaza continues unabated, and a United Nations study just released reports that 2 mothers an hour are dying in Gaza. 2 mothers an hour. On today's program, we're going to focus on the grassroots peace movement, both inside and outside of Israel. To that end, we have invited 2 guests from different organizations. First up will be Ido Setter from Standing Together. Standing Together is a movement based in Israel aimed at, quote, mobilizing Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel in pursuit of peace, equality, and social and climate justice, unquote. We'll find out how the peace movement is faring in the eye of the storm. Next, we speak to Stefanie Fox, head of Jewish Voice for Peace. Jewish Voice for Peace is the largest Jewish anti-Zionist organization in the world. They have been doing a tremendous amount of work in informing Americans, Jews, and Gentiles alike about the realities of Netanyahu's policies with their demonstrations and their daily Power Half Hour for Gaza Zoom calls, which give updates and encourage Americans to encourage their representatives in Congress to call for a ceasefire. As always, somewhere along the line, we'll check in with our vigorous corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's speak to an Israeli voice for peace. David?
Ido Setter works on Standing Together's digital mobilization team. Standing Together is a grassroots movement mobilizing Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel in pursuit of peace, equality, and social and climate justice. He joins us today from Israel. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Ido Setter.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Welcome indeed, Ido. First, before we get underway on some of the questions we have about the situation over there, describe your group, Standing Together. It's a pretty courageous group. It doesn't get all that much deserved media in the U.S. People in the U.S. don't know how much cooperation there is inside Israel on a day-to-day, daily basis between Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians. For example, over 20% of the pharmacists in Israel are Palestinians, Israeli Palestinians. And a lot of doctors are Israeli Palestinians. And a lot of bus drivers are Israeli Palestinians. So we had on earlier Miko Peled, who said there's already one state. The Israeli government controls all of Palestine. All we need are equal rights, and we're underway. So with that background, tell us about Standing Together, how it started, and what it does.
Well, Standing Together was founded at the end of 2015 and really began its activities then, and it advocates for peace, social justice, climate justice. And I think that the main thing to know about Standing Together is that it's a grassroots movement, a populist movement, a movement that tries to envision Israeli society in a different manner. Because we're used here in Israel-Palestine to divide or be divided to the regular axis of left or right, capitalist, socialist. And we, in Standing Together, we try to break those divisions and try to connect all the various communities that we have in Israeli-Palestinian societies, such as Russians, Ethiopians, Palestinians, Israelis, religious Jews, secular, and Muslims, Druze, and so forth, and try to connect with them and not to divide according to the left-right axis, but to connect on the basis of immediate interests of trying to work together and not to agree on everything, because that's impossible and it's also not a very good state, but to work together towards our mutual interests.
Ido, you describe Standing Together as not a NGO, in other words, not a citizen group, nonprofit citizen group advocating things, or you also say you're not a political party. So you're taking a very interesting status about what you do. Can you describe that? Because you say, quote, the leftist parties can no longer mobilize wide swaths of the Israeli public, and professional NGOs likewise fail to provide meaningful activism for the average layperson. Standing Together seeks to fill the void between these two groups. It's a grassroots movement rooted in inclusivity and pluralism, and you say we will unite the Israeli masses and propel them to action. How do you unite the Israeli masses, and what kind of action do you seek?
Well, I think that the first thing that we try to do is to say or to state that our future is much too important to be left to the hands of politicians. And we need to take matters into our own hands, and we're responsible for our future, and we can change our future. Because if we don't do that, politicians will do it for us. And being a grassroots movement, so we call it circles of activities or circles of activists throughout Israel, Palestine. And we do inside the communities from northern Israel to southern Israel. And we do communal work, and we just grow from bottom up, from the communities to public work and activism. And the main idea is to work together, to unite on the basis of my immediate interest, as for me as a secular Israeli, for someone else as a religious Muslim, but we still have common interests that we can cooperate and try to achieve together.
You say you have 8 regional chapters throughout Israel and 6 student chapters. Give us an idea of some of the events that you initiate, just so we know more clearly what Standing Together does on a regular basis.
Okay, it of course depends on the situation. In the past 3 months after October 7th, so it's very much related to the war, but also to the inside conflicts, to the inner conflicts that we recognize in Israel. And for example, we started a solidarity guard that was on the ground in various cities and erased racist slogans and made sure that no one will be hurt because he spoke Arabic in the street. And we initiated a hotline where you can phone in and say that you were fired from your job because you were such and such, or you said such things about the war or about Gaza or about Palestinians. And that's the main activities that we had in the past 3 months. But I think that like in regular times, if there are any regular times in Israel, so it's much more sort of a communal work, and we have key struggles that we fight. We had housing struggle in order to get the rent prices, try to make them more reasonable. And so each circle and each student chapter chooses its own fight to fight.
We're talking with Ido Setter, who is a spokesperson for Standing Together, a group in Israel. Now, this must be very difficult for you now since the October 7th Hamas attack and now the war on Gaza, which is horrendous and is turning a lot of world opinion against the Israeli regime of Bibi Netanyahu. You seek an end to the occupation. What is the final status do you see for Israel-Palestine? A one state, a two state? What do you mean by an end to the occupation?
Well, I can't really tell what's the end point, whether it will be one state or two states. What I can say is that it's a state where there will be equality and freedom for both people. And right now, what we have is the exact opposite, because the Israelis' right-wing government envisions this land as a land of only one people. So we need to, of course, end the war, reach a ceasefire agreement and end the war, and then move forward towards an agreement, because the only way for us, for Israelis, to live in security is to have a peace agreement with Palestinians. And the only way for Palestinians to have security and live next to us is to have a peace treaty with Israel. So This is a necessity, and I think that the important thing is to acknowledge each other's humanity, first of all, and it sounds basic, but we need to get to that stage as well, and then to acknowledge each people's rights and the right to self-definition and the right to life and security and peace. And so whether it will be one state or two states, I think right now we can't really know. But what we do know is that it's imperative to start talking about it, discussing it, and move towards it. Because if we don't do it, we are doomed to an everlasting war, which is the most horrible situation we can think about.
Well, these must be very repressive times for a group like Standing Together. Netanyahu has used this massive war on Gaza as a unifying force. How are you getting along? Are you being harassed? Are you being suppressed? Is your movement growing even now? Give us an idea.
Okay, so I must say that even in regular times, we're not the most popular kid on the block, and in these times as well, but our movement is growing. Ever since October 7th, our movement has been growing in hundreds of new members that have joined. We're going to have a big assembly, our yearly assembly in Haifa in 10 days, and it will be very, very big. So because of, I think that after October 7th, after the shock, so everyone spoke the same tone, but now we're more than 100 days after it, and people start to think differently and to see it in different light. So standing together, yes, I wouldn't say that we are being harassed, but dealing with the police is not always a treat, especially when we have a minister from the extreme right controlling the Israeli police right now, but we're dealing with them. We're holding our demonstrations, and we never give up. And one of our mottos says that where there is a struggle, there is hope. So even in those times, there are difficult times and maybe even dark times, but we can still find hope, and we can still try to inspire hope and give hope to the public.
Are you demanding an immediate ceasefire and the influx of many hundreds of trucks of humanitarian aid? I would assume a lot of Israelis, including obviously Israeli Arabs, are in favor of that. Are you standing up for that?
Absolutely, absolutely. This is for the short term. I think it must be done. It had to be done yesterday, as they say. But for the long term, I think that we must end the war. We must bring back the Israeli and Palestinian hostages that are being held in captivity by Hamas. We must bring them back alive, and the only way to bring them back alive is by making a deal. And we must cease the fire and stop bombing innocent civilians in Gaza. This is for the immediate short term, but for the long term, I think that October 7th taught us in a very harsh way that we simply cannot continue living as if occupation and military control over millions of Palestinians is a thing that just, the thing of the ordinary. It's not. It's something that we need to solve, and we need to reach an agreement. So short-term, ceasefire, bring back the hostages, stop the military operation, and longer term, and move forward to a peace treaty with the Palestinian people. Absolutely.
Well, given that Prime Minister Netanyahu has delayed an official investigation on how triple-tiered Israeli defenses, human intelligence, technological surveillance, warnings by Israeli military of activity in Gaza before October 7th, the receipt of the formal plans of Hamas a year ago, which were ignored. Is there growing skepticism here because he doesn't want an investigation, that this was something other than an unprecedented, complete, multi-tiered collapse of the defense against the Hamas attack?
Well, I think it's a combination of a couple of things. I think there is the strategical thing that happened, that the military wasn't prepared and the response was very slow, and the effect of surprise that could have been avoided. But I think that if we dive into it, there's a much worse thing that has been going on, because for the last, I think, 2 decades, Israeli governments and Israel as a state didn't offer any kind of hope for the Palestinians. There wasn't not a serious peace process, not serious talks. And basically, Israeli government said to Palestinians, listen, this is how things are going to be, deal with it. Okay. And when you don't offer any hope, so people will get to extreme places. So what happened on October 7th was, of course, a strategic collapse, but it also like an accumulation of the past 2 decades where Israel didn't think that moving forward to a peace treaty or kind of a peace agreement with the Palestinian people is an imperative.
Well,
And
close observers in the U.S. are puzzled in a variety of ways. One is why Prime Minister Netanyahu has said repeatedly, including to his Likud party in 2019, that his strategy obstructing a two-state solution is to support and help fund Hamas. He said that proudly. That was his strategy. And what's the view in Israel about his statement saying he actually supports and facilitates the funding of Hamas? And how did all these weapons get into Hamas's hands given the embargo and the siege? What's the discussion in Israel about these puzzling contradictions?
well, I think that the Israeli public begins to understand that Hamas and the Israeli extreme right wing is sort of a mirror image of each other. Because both sides, when their vision for this land is land that only one people occupies. Hamas wants it to be the Palestinian people, and the Israeli far right wants it to be the Jewish people. And both of them, the Israeli far right and Hamas, are the enemies to the concept of the Israeli-Palestinian peace. And I think that in that sense, there are many also Netanyahu that said what you quoted earlier, but also Bezalel Smotrich, Israeli prime minister, that said out loud flatly, Hamas is an asset we should nurture. And the Israeli right has been nurturing Hamas, not just with money, with Qatari money, also with money, but also with the concept, with the idea that there will never be peace. This conflict cannot be solved. And the only way to exist here in this land is with power, is to live by the sword. So I think that after what happened and after what we're seeing now in those past 3 months, I think that the Israeli public understands that Hamas cannot be destroyed just by military means, and that we cannot leave the situation as it is, because then we're heading just for the next round, and that we need to think outside of the box, as they say, and just to move forward and try something that we have never really tried in a serious manner, which is peace.
In the meantime, the deaths, injuries, sickness, infectious disease, bombardment, sniping continues in Gaza. It's now 2/3 destroyed in terms of buildings, and there seems to be no let up in the blockage of assistance to the desperate Palestinian families. There was a heartrending article in the Washington Post, January 22nd, on mothers trying to give birth, 5,000 births a month in Gaza, and there's nowhere to give birth to. On the roads, no medical assistance, no food, no water, no electricity. A desperate situation for the infirm, the elderly, the people who have had cancer, children, infants. Is there any compassionate wave starting in Israel about this massive slaughter that's going on? These are hundreds of thousands of impoverished families, children who had nothing to do with Hamas, nothing to do with October 7th.
Yes, absolutely. I think that after more than 100 days, Israeli public may have the capacity to start to do that and to feel that. But what we are in Standing Together try to say to the Israeli public is not only that we should feel compassion for the Palestinians, although of course we should be feeling compassion for them because that's the humane thing to do, but also that nothing stays on one side of the border. Everything that happens on the Palestinian side of the border eventually comes back to the Israeli side of the border. So it's also one of the most important Israeli interests to not have or to stop the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and to make sure that there's enough food and enough supplies for innocent civilians in Gaza, because this war is going to dictate our lives here for the next decade. And after it ends, and it will end one day, it will end, and it will end with an agreement, and then we'll have to live together. So in order to do that, we need to stop right now what's happening at the current moment in Gaza, have compassion, and move in the opposite direction that Benjamin Netanyahu and its hawkish government is trying to lead us.
And before we conclude, what would you want to say to President Joe Biden and the U.S. Congress, which seem to be a close ally of what Netanyahu's doing? And in order for them not to ask for a ceasefire, they are engaged in hostilities now, the U.S. that is, against the Houthis in Yemen. There are bombings in Iraq, Syria. It's quite a price the U.S. is paying because in order that Joe Biden, the Congress, not demand a ceasefire, because if there's a ceasefire, there'd be no Houthi sailing of shipping in the Red Sea. There would be no missiles with Hezbollah in Lebanon. What would you want to say to them, Congress and the President Joe Biden?
Sometimes the best advice you can give to your friend is to know when to stop.
Well, that's well said. Netanyahu keeps saying that he's engaged in this war for total victory so that Hamas can never do again to Israel what they did on October 7th. It seems to be a war that has no strategic ending but to keep Netanyahu in power and out of the prosecution process. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's correct, but I think it also has another meaning because we must remember that Netanyahu, he is the prime minister, but the people who are setting the tone in his government are people like Bezalel Smotrich that I mentioned earlier, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, extremist, right-wing, hawkish politicians. And so the other purpose of this war is just to be in war and to eradicate any chance to build a mutual future and to be engaged in a perpetual war that, I mean, nobody thinks that this war can eradicate Hamas, no matter what they say. I mean, after more than 3 months of unprecedented firepower that the IDF has been deploying in the Gaza Strip, Hamas is still active and is still, it won't be destroyed. But I think that Netanyahu and its very extreme colleagues, they want just to keep this state of war and to destroy any chance to build here a future of peace and security. And we must stop that, and we must offer an alternative. And I think that this is the main thing that we're trying to do this past 3 months, is to offer an alternative, not just to say this is wrong, and it is wrong, it is very wrong, but also to say, had we gone in the direction of peace 2 decades ago, 1 decade ago, a decade ago, maybe the October 7th wouldn't have happened. Okay, so maybe this is the lesson that we need, one of the lessons that we need to learn from this. And this is like a wake-up call, and we should go in this direction, not do what Israel always does, which is to use power and more power. It's futile. It gets nowhere.
Well, if things continue, as the chair of the Department of Global Health at the University of Glasgow pointed out, the prediction is that 500,000 people in Gaza will die in the current year. You're asking people to support Standing Together. How would they do that?
Well, if they're living outside of Israel, they can join Friends of Standing Together, which is a group of activity abroad, and they can also donate to Standing Together, and so we can broaden our activities. And they can also, of course, support us in social media and share our posts and like our posts and echo our ideas. We need this support. We want this support, and we want to spread our ideas in Israel, but also worldwide.
Can you give our listeners who wish to support you or find out more about Standing Together your website?
Yeah, it's www.standing-together.org. It's a Hebrew and Arabic site, but you have an English tab there, and then you can find all the information about us in English as well.
Well, thank you very much. We've been talking with Ido Setter, who is the spokesperson for Standing Together, a very courageous and grassroots effort over the years inside Israel. And we hope that the mass media in the United States will recognize what you've been doing as they go about reporting the bombing and the war on Gaza. Thank you very much, Ido.
Thank you very much.
We've been speaking with Ido Setter. We will link to his work at Standing Together at RalphNaderRadioHour.com. Up next, we turn to Stefanie Fox at Jewish Voice for Peace, But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, January 26, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau last week proposed a rule to rein in excessive overdraft fees charged by the nation's biggest financial institutions. The proposed rule would apply to insured financial institutions with more than $10 billion in assets, which covers approximately 175 of the largest depository institutions in the country. These institutions typically charge $35 for an overdraft loan, even though the majority of consumers' debit card overdrafts are for less than $26 and are repaid within 3 days. Under the proposal, banks could charge a fee to recoup their costs at an established benchmark as low as $3 or at a cost they calculate if they show their cost data. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Now we turn our attention to an American grassroots movement, Jewish Voice for Peace. David?
Stefanie Fox is the head of Jewish Voice for Peace. Jewish Voice for Peace is the largest Jewish anti-Zionist organization in the world. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Stefanie Fox.
Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome indeed, Stefanie. Let's start with your describing what Jewish Voice for Peace stands for in terms of the final status of Israel-Palestine. What do you recommend there? You've come out, obviously, for an immediate ceasefire, opening up massive humanitarian aid for the displaced, besieged, bombed people in Gaza. What do you foresee as the status, the permanent status over there? One state, two state, what?
Thanks so much for having me, Ralph. Jewish Voice for Peace, as the largest progressive Jewish anti-Zionist organization in the world, we're also very rooted as a U.S.-based organization, as a Jewish organization and a U.S.-based organization. And as such, we are, guided by a vision of winning justice and equality and dignity for all people, which in the case of Israel-Palestine obviously starts with Palestinian freedom. But we absolutely see that as a vision of a shared future. So we from here don't take a position on one state or two state or the system of governance that will govern the people that are not us, right? And that said, we're very clear on the principles that guide us and what we're fighting for, which is a shared future of peace and security and dignity for all people from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And that must start with justice, equality, freedom, and dignity for Palestinians.
And tell us what you've been doing for people who just focus on the mass media and don't hear or read or see about your activities. Tell us about what you've been doing since October 7th.
Well, we are a grassroots organization with members all over the U.S. in local communities, basically every community across the country, 85 some places, rabbinic council, students on campuses all over the country. And together we have been just mobilizing with everything in our power, our hearts, voices, souls, to bring an immediate and permanent ceasefire, to do so with sort of every ounce of power we've managed to build as a grassroots organization over the last 3 decades. So that has looked like, of course, probably 500,000 or more calls and emails to members of Congress and the Biden administration, but also a ton of action in the streets. We've been doing the largest in history sort of Jewish solidarity, civil disobedience actions that have ever happened. So we've shut down congressional offices and highways and bridges and federal buildings, just showing up and saying with our persistence and our real moral clarity, not in our name as Jews, not with our tax dollars as US citizens, and business as usual just cannot happen in the midst of an unfolding genocide. And so we have just brought everything we can to the task.
And to what extent are you having an impact in Congress? The pro-Palestinian rights movement in the U.S. seems to dominate the streets, but AIPAC and the pro-Netanyahu forces seem to dominate the suites. That is, the political suites in the White House and in the Department of State and, above all, in the Congress. Are you having a discernible change of heart among any members of Congress?
globally, there's absolute consensus, right, that this must stop immediately, that this is an unfolding genocide, that ceasefire now, and beyond that, that there is no military solution to decades of Israeli oppression of Palestinians, and we must see freedom in order to end all of this horrible bloodshed. So there's a global consensus about that. And quite frankly, what's amazing to see is that, 80% at least of Democratic voters in the US also support an immediate and permanent ceasefire. So we have the people, we have the grassroots power. It is politically popular to support Palestinian rights in this way. And at the same time, like you said, there is the horrifying and very, very obvious direct complicity and partnership of the US government, Congress, and the Biden administration in every bit of Israel's actions, both through, like exactly as you named, through impunity in every way and mechanism that the US government can manage, through continued massive funding with or without congressional approval, and through the continued funding and fueling of more weaponry into the hands of this genocide. And so we, of course, are opposing continued funding and arming of the attack on Palestinians in Gaza. And we are working to ensure that the power in the streets, as you said, actually translates to shifting the political calculus that upholds the US-Israel alliance undergirding Israeli apartheid. And that's a longer project, and one that we're right now in this sort of horrifying confrontation with, of just how intractable it feels. But I think we have to really be thoughtful about noticing where those cracks are. So we started with just a handful of members of Congress, and there are now at least 65 members of Congress calling for ceasefire. That grows by the day. We've seen congressional staffers, many Biden administration officials, hundreds, speaking out, registering their dissent. We have State Department officials, like you had Josh Paul on the program, coming out, even folks resigning over this moment. And so, I think that I keep reminding myself and our people that the surface cracks last. So there is all of that shaking happening based on the power that we have in the streets and that the grassroots is building. And it is creating a crisis, and it has not moved nearly fast enough. And it has been an unthinkably and unbearably large toll on Palestinians. But all of that is true at once.
Well, you were talking about cracks in Congress. Here's one crack that needs to be opened, which AIPAC cannot really stop once it gets underway. Since 1948, there's never been a hearing by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or the House Foreign Relations Committee inviting Israeli and Palestinian peace advocates. They've never had a voice on Capitol Hill with all the hearings that have been held since 1948. And you know that there have been former ministers in Israel, former jurists, mayors, security units heads who have opposed Netanyahu in Israel, and they've never had a voice in the U.S. Congress. And there have been Palestinian peace advocates who, well acquainted with their Israeli counterparts, they've never had a voice. Do you think that should be a priority, to push the House and Senate to give these Israelis and Palestinians a voice, and that would break the grip to some substantial degree of AIPAC on Congress, which has stifled the voices who want to wage peace instead of war?
I absolutely think those voices should be in the center of the conversation. Palestinians in particular have been systematically and very intentionally silenced and boxed out of conversations, and not just conversations, but political decisions and billions of dollars of taxpayer money that directly are going to slaughter their families, even as they are US citizens here. So ensuring that Palestinian and other voices of conscience are in the center of the conversation is critical. I would also say that we're past the time for conversation. And so that's why we're so pleased to see things like the court case brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights on behalf of 2 Palestinian human rights orgs and a couple of dozen of Palestinians in Gaza and the United States, bringing the Biden administration to court for not just failing to prevent, but actually active complicity in Israel's genocide of Palestinians. That court case will have a hearing this Friday. And I think it's so essential that it not just be about like, oh, the US needs to think differently or talk differently about this, but actually our government is direct partners in this genocide. And so being brought to account for that complicity is essential. So I'm really happy that's happening.
Well, members of Congress, as you know, Stefanie, always have this one sentence: Israel has a right to defend itself. Of course, Israel doesn't indicate what itself is. It doesn't have firm borders other than all of Palestine. But in the last 50 years or more, over 400 more times Palestinian innocents have been killed and injured compared to Israeli innocents who have been killed and injured in these periodic conflicts. Over 400 times. Do you speak out by saying Palestinians have a right to defend themselves as well?
Well, international law is clear that the Israeli government has, under no circumstances, that nothing justifies the genocide unfolding before our eyes, but also that the concept of like the Israeli government defending itself, quote unquote, against a population it besieges and occupies and carries out apartheid over is not protected under international law in the way that it puts forward that it is. And we think it's incredibly important to understand that this did not start in October, that we're looking at 75 years of Israeli colonization and apartheid and injustice and oppression of Palestinians, and that the only way out of this horrifying moment that we're in is to realize Palestinian rights and freedom.
You've been under assault by groups like AIPAC and allied groups. They've been accusing you of just about everything, including anti-Semitism. Imagine accusing Jewish Voice for Peace of anti-Semitism. But do you ever talk about the anti-Semitism against the Arab Palestinians? Give us your views on that.
Great. I'm glad you raised this. Let me take it in a couple of directions. First, just to speak to sort of the semantics of the term Semite and what does anti-Semitism mean, just to quickly ground us, the term Semite comes out of 19th century scientific racism. It's not really something in any moment in history that anybody has actually used to describe themselves as a Semite. It's only a racist term, And so the term anti-Semitism does refer to the bigotry and discrimination that emerged out of that racist classification system, and at its root comes from the same white supremacy in which anti-Palestinian racism and erasure and Zionism itself were born. So the point is not that anti-Semitism is not about Jews, which it is. And of course, anti-Semitism is real. There's real hatred and bigotry and discrimination against Jews. The point is that anti-Semitism and white supremacy and Zionism emerge from the same root of exclusionary, ethno-nationalist, racialized state building, and we have to fight them all together. The answer is solidarity amongst and between our communities and a vision of collective liberation that challenges that white supremacy and ethno-nationalism. So that's just on the term itself. But what we're seeing now, you're absolutely right, is it's an Orwellian nightmare. There are very, very intentional, systematic attempts by organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, AIPAC, to misstate, confuse, and even legally redefine the word anti-Semitism in order to conflate it with all criticism of Israel or any effort to hold the Israeli government accountable for its oppression of Palestinians. So, it should go without saying to your audiences and to all audiences that opposition to the political movement of Zionism or to the policies of the Israeli state or any state is no different than any attack on or criticism of a political ideology or the policies of a nation state. But there's this campaign to equate Jewishness and Jews with this rogue state actively committing genocide. And that puts Palestinians, as we see, in immense danger. And frankly, as a Jew, it also, it's a huge danger to Jews, because if everything is anti-Semitism, then nothing is, and at a time when white supremacists and white nationalists are going to take advantage of this moment to promote anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia and real anti-Semitism, misstating and misdefining it is incredibly dangerous for all of our communities.
Well, let's talk about the situation on campuses. Now, we're talking with Stefanie Fox, the executive director of Jewish Voice for Peace. You're quite familiar with what's going on campus. Inform our listeners what happened at Columbia University recently.
Yes. Well, the first point to make is that a government doesn't use these tools of repression as its bludgeon to shut down the conversation if it has any ability to fight on the terms that are presented, right? To actually have a conversation in the open. So we need to understand these massive and like very terrifying tools of repression that are happening, especially on campuses, but even more broadly than that, to shut down the movement for Palestinian rights and freedom as a sign of the merits and growth and power of that movement and its rightness. That said, it's a very scary time, particularly for Palestinians and for anybody who's willing to stand up for Palestinian rights. As you mentioned at Columbia University just this week, not only have the student groups SJP and our own JVP chapter been banned for no good reason, but just absolutely to try to shut down their activism. And they've been fighting that for a couple of months now, but a protest this week with about 300 students, they were attacked with a military grade weapon, skunk, which anybody who's familiar with the IDF's operations in the West Bank and beyond knows is a horrifying chemical warfare that's designed, it smells like a combination of dead animal and excrement, and it soaks into the skin and clothes and is like impossible to wash off. It leads to nausea, all kinds of medical complications, haziness, memory loss, and students days later are still in the hospital or suffering from those very symptoms. Were attacked and sprayed with this chemical weapon, likely allegedly by ex-IDF soldiers who are students at Columbia University. And, this took the administration days to even respond to, while we're seeing this hysteria, this real new McCarthyism. What is the conversation? Did somebody say there should be freedom from the river to the sea? And meanwhile, Palestinian students are getting shot for wearing keffiyeh, getting attacked like this with literal chemical warfare, are facing doxing and the loss of their jobs. Like it is a crisis, and Palestinian lives are so dehumanized, including in the United States. It's a very scary moment for these student activists who are continuing to bravely speak out. We must be very clear-eyed that attacks against Palestinians and anti-Zionists are a wide open door for the far right looking to criminalize all forms of protest, to gut academic freedom, to roll back racial justice project. It's not like a slippery slope. It is a iced over mountain road that the Biden administration and the US Congress are just barreling down at top speed, imperiling everybody.
Certainly, this whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict is having severe effects in the U.S., not just in terms of military budget, but also freedom of speech, as you pointed out. What can you tell us about J Street, which is a fairly large organization that developed to counter the AIPAC lobby, and they retreated a bit after October 7th, but are they coming back to their original mission?
The position of demanding an immediate and permanent ceasefire is a centrist position. And there is no justification in the world for the way in which Biden administration and US Congress, and from where we sit, Jewish communal organizations have refused to call for a ceasefire. It requires a great moral reckoning for all of those institutions and actors. The fact that it took more than 100 days and more than 25,000 Palestinians slaughtered for J Street to finally this week call for, as they said, it is no longer the time for war. We would argue it's never the time for war after decades of oppression, occupation, and apartheid, to see that then this genocide has happened with the drums of war being beat by the political establishment, and for many months has included J Street. I will say we welcome that they are now calling for what is a ceasefire, and I think, like I said, is a reckoning to be done with what has already occurred and what is unfolding from here.
Why would a country like Israel, in terms of popular opinion, register over 85% support for whatever the Israeli military, whatever it's doing in Gaza?
I think, if you look at the International Court of Justice case brought by South Africa against Israel, explaining in very detailed terms the legal case for exactly why this is genocide, echoing what Palestinians have been saying from the beginning. It really details the intent that Israeli government officials have made clear from the very beginning. We will make Gaza an uninhabitable place, a place not fit for human life. This will be the carrying out of the second Gaza Nakba. This will be We will, the very direct, explicit claims that they would raze Gaza to the ground, make it unlivable, force everybody out, and aim to eliminate the population in whole or part, as is the definition of genocide. And to then see it play out directly, specifically, fully in the acts being carried out here, it's a waking nightmare to watch happen. And there's no denying it, right? They are saying what they're doing. They're doing exactly what they said they would do. And we all have to just really understand that it didn't start in October, and that it won't end when we reach the soonest possible moment that we can, a ceasefire. That this is a devastating playing out of what the Israeli government has been unfolding from its inception. And we have to just stand so firmly against that and so clear-eyed about the only future that's possible here, which is one of freedom and dignity and peace rooted in those things.
Give us your view of where Congress is going to be this year on this matter in terms of appropriations, the genocide tax of $14.3 billion, and other positions.
Well, I think that, to underscore your point, that it is a U.S. funded, fueled, and fully complicit genocide. It's not the actions of the Israeli government over separately. It is our government is in full partnership in this genocide. And so members of Congress are going to continue to hear from their constituents who are outraged and horrified, and are not going to rest until this is over, and are not going to forget that this is exactly what they're doing with our taxpayer dollars and in our names. So there is a political cost that the grassroots space is going to grow and to build and to take out. And I think that it can't come a minute too soon, because that impunity extended by the US for decades now is what has led us to this moment, that it is not just, oh, this didn't just happen. This is genocide occurs only in the case in which, the US has made it very clear that we will block all efforts to hold the Israeli government accountable for decades of occupation and apartheid and constant violence against Palestinians. And so now is the time when, as the sort of global movement is building and rising so strongly to demand rights and freedom for Palestinians, that the US is going to have to grapple with how out of touch it is with the rest of the world and with the people right here.
Under international law, the U.S. is considered a co-belligerent with Israel in what's going on in Gaza. It's more than just complicity, it's co-belligerency. How do you think it's going to affect the election, since Trump is probably even worse than Biden, because Trump wants the Israeli regime of Netanyahu to annex the West Bank and Gaza? How do you think this is going to play with young voters, or just voters? How are they going to deal with this issue?
Well, the Nation just reported on a poll that showed that, voters, that they will support candidates who've been active in advocating for and calling for ceasefire over those who haven't by more than 2-1. And, I think that there is a grave need for the voices of people of conscience throughout the US to actually pierce through and make a difference in the actions of policymakers, like Motaz Azeza, who's an incredible journalist who's risked his life for, over 100 days broadcasting Israel's genocide to the world, said this thing a few weeks ago of like, don't call yourself a free person if you can't make changes, if you can't stop a genocide that's ongoing. And so I think for Americans to say, can I call myself a free person if the vast majority of Democrats are calling for this, and yet we see no shift in US policy. And so I think that there's a calling to account that is happening now and will continue to happen into the election cycle.
Steve?
Stefanie, tell us about the half-hour power hours you've been doing daily.
Yes, we have a daily space that brings together, between 300 and 1,000 people every single day to take action in community to, channel our grief and rage into political action together. So together we've called and emailed Congress more than 500,000 times. We've helped create protest ideas. We've written hundreds and hundreds of letters to editor. We take action every single day. It's like, what is going on? Where is our impact able to happen? And how do we move together as a community? So in addition to being in the streets, it's a great space to come, get renewed, be in community, have a political home, and take discrete action each and every day, because there's always, always, always more we can be doing to stop this genocide and be advancing the call for freedom.
Are you getting local media? Because you're certainly not getting much media in the New York Times or Washington Post. Are you getting local media for these daily actions?
Yes, a lot, we have over, 85 chapters and local groups all across the country, and they're, woven in and a part of movement in all of those communities. And I think that there's been quite a lot of local press that is showing the consistent call and demand on members of Congress, pushing them and disrupting business as usual. So that has definitely been a steady beat throughout all of this. And also, none of us can ignore the way that mainstream media is covering this in a very biased way, and sort of refusing to show the incredible consensus around call for ceasefire and the need for Palestinian freedom.
David?
Stefanie, as an American Jew, did your position emerge fully formed as a child, or was there an evolution?
There was certainly an evolution. I think that, like for many Jews, I was raised to kind of understand core Jewish values as being connected to the preciousness of human life. We say, "B'Tselem Elohim," every single life is made in the image of God, is infinitely and equally precious, and was both raised with that and with a kind of understanding that the Israeli government and state and Zionism itself was intended to protect and be safeguarding of Jews, and a response to Jewish persecution, and sort of trying to come to terms over time with the real nature of Zionism and decades of persecution and colonization of Palestinians and their land in my name, and sort of having to grapple with that harm done and how absolutely it has nothing to do with the safety of my community. For me, that took years, like it does for many Jews. But once I understood it, irrefutable, you can't go back. And so to be welcomed into the movement for Palestinian rights and freedom, so fully and wholly, and to feel that like coming together of a Jewish community centered on justice and in deep solidarity with Palestinians fighting for their own lives is, it's the greatest honor and privilege of my life.
Are you invited to address any synagogues?
There is a large and growing community of faith leaders, of rabbis, of synagogues, of many, many Jews who are working to build a Judaism liberated from Zionism. And so there's probably 10 synagogues across the country that are anti or non-Zionist. There are dozens of independent spiritual communities called Havarot that are connected or not to Jewish Voice for Peace. There's just a really burgeoning and growing movement to fight for the soul of Judaism, to fight for the future of our communities and we have millennia of Jewish tradition that predate the founding of the State of Israel and the movement of political Zionism to lean on and to extend into a future where we are not bound up and made complicit in support for a genocidal ethno-state.
Francesco?
I attended George Washington University, and during my time there, anti-Zionist Jewish activist students faced vicious retaliation by Zionist groups like Canary Mission. What would you say to student activists facing retaliation today?
I would say that your voice and your activism and your persistence is so incredibly important. It is intentional that the Israeli government and its backers and supporters have focused so fully on shutting down and silencing your voice, and it's because of what an essential role it plays in moving the dial and advancing the work toward Palestinian freedom. So know that there's an entire community with and behind you, and that while the threats are very real, so is the moral rightness of what you're doing, and the irrefutability that you are on the right side of history and you are making a tremendous difference in advancing the cause.
We've been talking with Stefanie Fox, Executive Director of Jewish Voice for Peace. Stefanie, how can people get in touch with you, support Jewish Voice for Peace? Do you want to give your website slowly?
www.jvp.org, and join us. Like we were just talking about the daily power hour every single weekday for a half an hour. Come channel your rage and grief and horror into meaningful political action and find a political home with us or with one of our beloved close partners in the movement.
You've really innovated in terms of civic advocacy. You know, most civic advocacy tends to plateau, and it just expresses itself by we protest, we demand, same old marches without creative use of the marches to raise money with people's cell phone or hold pictures of lawmakers that they want to persuade as they march. You've really innovated in so many ways, and I hope you keep doing that. We've been speaking with Stefanie Fox, the Executive Director of Jewish Voice for Peace. Thank you very much, Stefanie, for your work and that of your associates.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've been speaking with Stefanie Fox. We will link to her work at Jewish Voice for Peace at RalphNaderRadioHour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Ido Setter and Stefanie Fox. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we're joined by Eva Borgward from If Not Now, another grassroots progressive organization. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. If listeners want to join the hundreds of thousands of calls by Americans coming in opposition to the genocide tax of $14.3 billion that Congress is considering tapping into taxpayer money to support more weapons for the Israeli regime, just call 202-224-3121. A telephone call is more effective than an email, and most effective is a postage-mailed letter. Have them hear your voice. Stop the genocide tax. American taxpayers should never have to pay for the Israeli government's massive defense collapses that allowed October 7th to occur.
Oh, you've been sitting way too long. Oh, step up. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. Rise up.